Hi guys, so today I want to make some beer. So today I've chosen a very simple style IPA. It's an all grain recipe that's brew in a bag. And the real kind of philosophy behind this video is I want to make this as easy as possible. To also kind of help facilitate this further, I'm going to be making a smaller quantity, what's known as a 1 gallon batch, which is about 4 liters for you metric people. I find that this kind of batch size is very manageable if you're just kind of getting into brewing for the first time, or if you have a smaller apartment and just don't have room for all of the larger equipment. Now, if this is your first time, brewing beer is a total rabbit hole of terminology, equipment, and techniques, and I'm really aiming to make this video as simple as possible. So I'm going to just show one method for brewing beer, when in reality there are many different ways of doing it. Really, this video is aimed to be something that I wish that I had when I first started making beer. Something short, sweet, and hopefully not overly complicated. Additionally, to kind of help with this, I've teamed up with the people from Clockwork. We've developed kind of a really nice timed method that will go through each step. I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end. All right, so let's jump into it. So the first thing that we need to talk about are supplies. Now for the beer itself, we're gonna need some malted barley, we're gonna need hops, and we're gonna need yeast. I'll go into specifics later and also post the recipe down in the description. But outside of the ingredients for the beer, we're also gonna need a little equipment. Specifically, we're gonna need a straining bag, a thermometer, a big pot, enough to hold all of our liquid. Additionally, we're gonna need a fermentation vessel, some sanitizer, and a way for measuring the sugar concentration of the liquid, such as a hydrometer or a refractometer. Additionally, we're gonna also need a bottling bucket, some tubing, and some bottles. Now, that does sound like a lot, and this may seem daunting if you don't have any of this equipment, but generally you can pick up a beginner's kit for brewing for about $100, and I'll include some links down in the description down below. Now, when you're trying to be able to purchase the ingredients for this, if you can, try to pick up some stuff from your local homebrew store. They're typically very friendly people and understanding, especially if it's your first time making beer. However, I'll provide a link down to my local homebrew store, which should ship to you. Okay, so let's get to the actual recipe. So for this recipe, we're gonna need about 2.5 pounds or about 1.15 kilograms of American 2-row malt. Now this malt will provide the majority of the sugar to the beer and therefore kind of the food for the yeast, which will be turned into alcohol. However, this specific malt is kind of light on flavor. So for this reason, we're also going to add about 3 ounces or 85 grams of what's known as Crystal 20 and 3 ounces of Crystal 60. Now these malts have been basically toasted in a kiln, which gives them color and a toasted flavor, which will help make our beer more complex. So when you're buying malt, one thing to note is that malt needs to be crushed before it can be used, kind of like coffee beans. So if you don't have a barley crusher, be sure to purchase the malt crushed when you get it from your homebrew store. All right, so we're gonna weigh out that malt and then store it in kind of a bowl off to the side for right now. So the first major step in brewing beers, we actually just need to get the sugar out of the grains. In reality though, we're not actually going to be able to extract sugar from the grains because it's actually stored in the form of starch. So what we're doing is we're gonna create an environment for the enzymes in the skin of the barley to begin to be able to break down that starch into fermentable sugar. For more info on how this process works, be sure to check out my Science of Bread video where I go into this quite in depth. So one of the things that we're really gonna need for beer brewing is a large pot. We need to make sure it's big enough to hold all of the liquid that we're gonna boil, as well as make sure that it's large enough to prevent boilovers, which can happen later. I'm gonna be using a 12 quart or a 12 liter pot. Anything larger will definitely work. Anything smaller could also work, but you're also at the risk of things being difficult for you. So go ahead and fill this pot up with about 4.5 quarts or about 4.25 liters of water. And we're gonna heat this water to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees Celsius. This water is what's known as the strike water. And what will happen is when we throw our barley in there, it will rapidly bring the temperature of the barley up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit or about 65.5 degrees Celsius. This is the ideal temperature for the enzymes to start doing their business of breaking down the starch and turning it into fermentable sugar. While the strike water heats up, we can pour all of our measured barley into our straining bag. I mean, essentially what we're doing is making a giant tea bag. So once our strike water is up to temperature, gently lower the bag into the water, ensuring that all of the grains of barley are submerged in the hot water. And then if you can, take a spoon and kind of mix up the grains within the bag, making sure that none of the grains escape the bag. We just want to make sure there's a nice even temperature throughout the grain. Now the name of the game is just to kind of maintain this temperature over the course of an hour, so we have time for the enzymes to really break down this starch and turn it into sugar. Now because we have a nice thermal mass of water, thankfully the temperature is not going to drop too quickly. However, as the pot is cooled by the surrounding air, the entire temperature will drop. And if it gets too cold, the enzymes won't have an ideal environment and you'll get less sugar from your barley. So to raise the temperature, simply turn on your burner for about 30 seconds to a minute. However, be careful to raise the bag off the bottom of the pot. If the barley or the bag come in contact with the hot burner, it can scorch the bag or the barley and leave a nasty off-tasting flavor. Additionally, we want to make sure that we don't overheat the liquid or mash as it's known, over 155 degrees Fahrenheit or about 68 degrees Celsius, or this will just kind of hamper the enzyme activity. While this goes over the course of an hour, in a separate pot, we want to heat up about 3.5 quarts or about 3.3 liters of water to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit. So after an hour of the enzymes doing their business, we can pull the bag up and let the liquid drain from it. Slowly pour the heated water over the bag, and this will help rinse off the grains, catching any sugar left in the bag. If you have a hydrometer or a tool for measuring the level of sugar in the water, this is a great time to take a measurement. This will give us a sense of how much sugar there is to ferment, and therefore what we might expect to get in terms of alcohol per volume in our final beer. So if we've done everything right, we should be looking at a sugar concentration or gravity of about 1.039. I know they're really weird units. If you've missed your target and you got less sugar than you were hoping for, no worries, we can fix this. What you'll need though is something called dry malt extract, which is just basically a fancy way of saying powdered malt sugar, which is the sugar that we're using in actually brewing. Now, adding this powdered malt sugar won't alter the flavor of the beer, and it will help you reach the right sugar concentration in case you missed it. So I will include a link to a calculator to help you figure out how much malt extract to add in case your sugar concentration is off. So you measure how much you have, and then you measure the goal, which is 1.039, and you can calculate how much of the malt powder to add. Okay, so now I always find that that's the most stressful part of brewing beer. At this point, it's kind of downhill from here. So now we're ready to heat this entire sugar mixture that we have, which is known as wort, up to boiling. So we can actually really begin brewing. One thing to really note is as this wort heats up, there will be a stage where it really begins to foam up. And this is what's known as the hot break. If you have a pot that's not large enough, this foam will go over the edge and all over your stovetop, and it's really sticky and nasty, and you really don't want to deal with that. So if it's looking like it's threatening to boil over, carefully move the pot off the heat and stir it rapidly and just to kind of cool this down as quickly as possible. Now, once you've kind of gotten past this first wave, it's less likely to do that again for the rest of the brew. But once you do get past the hot break, it should start boiling soon. And it's also not a bad time to weigh out the first addition of hops. Now, hops will add a bitter and kind of complicated florally flavor to the beer, which provides a nice contrast to the sweet malt. So in our first addition of hops, we need 0.1 ounce or about 3 grams of Cascade hop pellets. So once the wort is officially boiling, we can add in our first addition of hops and start a timer for 1 hour. And we're gonna let this wort boil with the lid off and add in more hops throughout the boil. Just keep an eye on it, but otherwise there really isn't much to do during this time. It's often recommended that it's a good time to crack open a beer, preferably a homebrew one, and relax as it brews. 30 minutes into the boil, we wanna add our second addition, which is 0.2 ounce or 6 grams more of the Cascade pellets. Once the 60 minutes is up, we can turn off the heat source and add in our final addition, which is 0.25 ounces or 7 grams of Citra hop pellets. All right, so now at this point we have a precursor to the beer. All that needs to be done is we need to add the yeast in so that the yeast can turn our sugary liquid into beer. However, if we poured the yeast directly in right now, the high temperature of the wort would just kill all of our yeast. So we need to cool this liquid down to a reasonable temperature, and preferably as quickly as possible. So for this, I submerge my pot into a sink full of cold water, and the cold water will heat up quickly, and then you just add more cold water and just do this a couple times. Without special cooling equipment, which can be quite expensive, don't be surprised if this takes you half an hour or longer for this to cool down. As this cools down, it's time to discuss the enemy. We've made a nice sugary liquid which many bacteria, fungi, and other critters would love to eat. And we only want one thing to consume this liquid, which is our yeast. Now, yeast will convert this sugar into alcohol, and as the beer becomes more alcoholic, it'll begin to stave off other would-be sugar thieves. However, before we get to this point, the yeast will be competing against everything else that's in this liquid, and we really just want the yeast to become the dominant organism. If any other organism takes over, it will infect the beer, ruining all this hard work that we've done for it. For that reason, we want to make sure that we sanitize all the equipment coming in contact with the cooled wort. The spoons, even the scissors used to open the yeast packet itself, and we're just doing that in an attempt to reduce the chances of infecting our beer. So to sanitize the equipment, I use what's known as Star San. It's a cheap and simple product that doesn't require rinsing afterwards. So returning to our beer, using a sanitized thermometer, measure the temperature of the wort. Once it reaches about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or about 20 degrees Celsius, it's time to transfer this into our fermentation vessel. I'm using a 2-gallon plastic jug, and I'm transferring it using a sanitized auto siphon into the fermentation vessel. Make sure to follow the levels of the wort down with the siphon, and this will help reduce the amount of hop crud, or what's also known as trub, that gets transferred into our fermentation vessel. Now's a good time to take a measurement of the sugar concentration. If we know the initial sugar concentration before fermentation, and if we measure again after, we can calculate the total alcohol percentage of the beer. Once it's been transferred, we can pitch our yeast, which basically just means sprinkling our yeast over the liquid. I'm using a Safrail SO5 yeast here, which is kind of the generic kind of clean fermenting yeast. So just go ahead and put on the lid and give it a good shake to aerate the wort and also mix the yeast into our liquid. Place the little gas release thingy on top and add some sanitized water to that, and bam, we are good to go. After a few days, it isn't a bad idea to just kind of observe it and check to see how things are going. At that point, you should have passed through a stage where we're getting bubbles consistently from the container. And this is basically what's happening is as the yeast consumes sugar, CO2 gas builds up and will be basically released from this gas valve. If you aren't seeing any bubbles, don't worry. Just make sure the lid is on nice and tight. And also, if you're kind of fermenting in cooler temperatures, the whole process might take a little bit longer. After about 7 days, the beer should be more or less done, and it's not a bad idea to check in on it and see what's going on. Just take off the lid. It should have a very fresh alcohol beery smell, and you should see what's known as the Kreuzen, or basically like little bits of foam on the side that just kind of indicated that the beer went through the fermentation process. Go ahead and measure the sugar concentration again. I'll include a link to a calculator where we can take the initial measurement before fermentation and then the measurement afterwards to calculate the total alcohol per volume. Now, at this point, you have two options. One is to go straight to bottling, or the second is you can do this additional step known as dry hop. And this will give you that really craft beer smell and vibe to your beer. So after the 7 days of fermentation, if you choose to do dry hopping, you can toss in 0.5 ounces or about 14 grams of citra hop pellets. Now, because we aren't heating these hops, it won't really transfer any bitterness, but rather the aroma and floral characteristic of the hops. If you choose to dry hop, let these soak for about 5 days, at which point we can actually bottle. All right, so at this point, we should be ready to bottle. Transfer your beer from your primary fermenter into a sanitized bottling bucket, using that same trick to kind of just avoid all of the crud that's accumulated at the bottom. Mostly at this point, that should be yeast. Additionally, we're gonna add a little of what's known as priming sugar. And essentially this will kind of cause the yeast to start fermenting again. But when we do this in a sealed bottle, it will create CO2 in the bottle, which will carbonate our beer. For a gallon of beer, we're gonna need 21 grams or 0.75 ounces of table sugar, just dissolved into some water. We don't need to add much. Just mix this into the beer that we have, and make sure that it's thoroughly mixed. Using the spout on the bottling bucket, we can just fill these cleaned and sanitized bottles with our beer. Place the sanitized caps onto the bottles and crimp it closed. And that's basically it. We're gonna let this sit for another week so that the carbonation process can take off. And 1 week later, we should have a nice homebrew. Now, one tip here when drinking homebrew is that it's alive, unlike what you might get at the store. And what that means is that there's gonna be some residual yeast chilling on the bottom of your bottle. It's perfectly safe to drink. However, if you don't wanna drink it or if it skeeves you out, just pour the homebrew into a glass and you can kind of leave the yeast at the bottom. So that's it. Now, the process for making a 5-gallon batch, or about 5 times the amount, is practically the same, but for your first few brews, I found it personally easier and also cheaper to deal with smaller quantities of liquid. Thank you for following this video. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you went through this whole thing and you were like, oh my God, there's just so many steps, so much to do, and it's gonna take me forever to follow this, there's actually a solution. So I partnered up with the people at Clockwork and developed a way to have a timed instruction as an app. So it'll send notifications to your phone at various points for each step. This should be released at the same time as this actual video. To be able to kind of support this for them and for me, I am charging some money for this, but that money is really helpful for me and I really appreciate the support for people who choose to do this. If not, I will have everything out in the description if you want to do it the old school method. Okay, so with that being said, thank you for watching, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. Okay, thank you, bye.